Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in AP English. We now turn to Charles Dickens' classic Tale of Two Cities, the 1859 historical novel. I know we always play this game of what's the greatest novel of all time. Well, there are a whole lot of people who argue this may be it. If you want to count number of volumes sold, one of the greatest blockbusters of all time, we might say. I'm going to argue for you that, and put this in your notes right away, this is really one of the greatest love stories of all time. Now, we're going to have to define what we mean by love story, no question, and yet I think by the time we get to the end of this novel and we begin to dissect it a bit, we're going to say, you know, this novel seems to suggest that there's tremendous power in love, true love, right? It's also Tale of Two Cities, a great treatment of the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille, and this notion of mob hysteria, which kind of can take over when craziness starts to happen because of fear. This is no doubt Dickens' probably best known story, although obviously The Christmas Carol and the story of Scrooge, and we reference it many times in 303, is another one, as we said, sometimes called the best-selling novel of all time. Of course, the opening lines of the novel are really famous. I mean, let's just read the opening lines. And you've probably heard it. Maybe you've heard it and didn't know that it came from this novel. The opening of the first chapter. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We had all going direct to heaven. We had all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. Now, those of us who write say, if I could just write, a few lines like that once in my life, I'd be accorded greatness. Dickens does it again and again. Also, notice the dualisms that are a part of that when we talk about our Hegelian duality and that notion of the thesis-antithesis and the friction between the two to produce a synthesis. There is a reading, and certainly a Hegelian reading of this novel that we can get into later. Let's talk a little bit about Dickens. Of course, as we've said already, we know something about his Christmas Carol from 1843. We do have a reference to Hard Times, the novel Hard Times, on learnstrong.net in the senior B folder. Maybe the greatest novelist of all time. Certainly there's always a debate. In the top 5 for sure, we will say that if you just look at what he produced and the effect that he had over time, I think there's a good argument to be made that along with Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and a few other great novelists, certainly Dickens belongs there. Born February 7th, 1812, dies the 8th of June in 1870. A great social critic. Think about Oliver Twist and his "More Please" request that becomes in many ways a critique of the ways in which poverty determines so much of the lives of a certain class of individuals that Dickens knew well. He had a rough life growing up. His father actually ended up in debtor's prison. He ended up a celebrity as well. In many ways, he's one of the first great true celebrities. I mean, he makes visits all over the world to America for the first time in 1842. Now, our assumptions, we always like to say them in advance. We always began, of course, with our learning theory, that desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. We do that in our learning, reading theory, our annotative reading, with our 3 levels question. At level 1, what does the text say? At level 2, what does the text mean? At 2A, themes, messages, along with our big 5, as we refer to them. That is to say, what does this novel say about epistemology, what you can know, ontology, who you are, psychology, the study of the individual mind, powerful example here, and then sociology. What happens when you put a bunch of people together and how they work? This is going to be a powerful novel in that regards. And then finally, the question of theodicy. Why does pain and suffering have to be a part of the human existence, and who's responsible for it? I think all of that is discussed here in vivid detail. At level 2B, we're talking the rhetorical level, not what Dickens says, but how he says it. We'll continue to kind of focus on symbolism and irony. We're going to see a whole lot of it in this novel. At level 3, we ask, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? Don't just take my word for it that this is a great novel. Pick up the novel, read it, and let me help you maybe come to some terms with how you can relate to it. First of all, to other texts that we already have studied or will study, texts we already know. And then finally, of course, how can I relate this information to myself personally? The other assumption here is that you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net in the AP folder and elsewhere. And of course that you've read this novel on your own and you're kind of coming to our study here to help you through it. Well, let's begin. I read you the opening lines. We are in 1775. And there is no question things are going bad, both for France as well as for England. We have Jerry Cruncher at the very beginning of the novel. He's kind of an odd job guy who works for the Tellson's Bank. He will stop the Dover mail coach, and we're going to have an important message for Jarvis Laurie. The message is going to tell Laurie that he needs to wait at Dover for a young woman. Laurie responds with the cryptic words, recalled to life. Now, write this down. I mean, this is very much like reading the novel Jane Eyre. We're going to have all kinds of mysterious, secretive kinds of things going on early in the novel, which should lead you to want to ask, what's going on in this novel? And obviously keep reading. Recalled to life, and what's that about? That will be a significant mantra throughout the novel, and certainly at the end of the novel. At Dover, Laurie's met by Lucille Manette, a young orphan whose father, once really famous doctor, right? She thinks is dead, has been discovered in France. So, you know, you've got an interesting kind of story going on there. Laurie's going to escort Lucy to Paris. They're going to meet Defarge, a former servant of Manette who kept Manette safe, actually, in a garret. He was driven mad by 18 years in the Bastille, and this is going to be a pivotal psychological investigation for Dickens in this novel. When you put people under tremendous psychic strain, what happens to them? And we're going to find that Manette, in fact, for 18 years, was in the Bastille, treated terribly, spent all of his time making shoes there. This was a hobby he picked up in prison. And the notion of making shoes is a pivotal symbol, I think, in a lot of ways to the reading of this, because shoes are, of course, something that we all need, yes, and of course something that differentiates in many ways. I think about ball players and the kids who want to emulate ball players by buying their shoes, and it becomes a powerful symbol, right? Laurie will assure Lucy that her love and devotion can in fact help her father come back to life, and indeed that's exactly what happens. Then we jump ahead, 1780. So Dickens, and some have found this to be a weak novel in this regards, because we kind of move around and we kind of go through history. I think Dickens is assuming a readership, and this is what makes sometimes this novel hard to read today, a readership that kind of knows a whole lot of the history already. We have Charles Darnay. He's standing accused of treason against the English crown. We got a lawyer. He's kind of a, you know, the adjective sometimes bombastic is used. He's kind of, you know, braggadocious lawyer, strider, who is trying as much as possible to plead the case for Darnay, right? But it's not until a drunk colleague, a ne'er-do-well, Sidney Carton, will step up and assists Charles Darnay in the court and hopes to acquit, actually, Darnay. Carton, now we want to pay attention to this Sidney Carton. Carton will, in fact, come to the conclusion of his argument by pointing out that he himself actually looks a whole lot like Darnay. And to that degree, we shouldn't be too absolutely, or we might say in our Big Five, epistemologically certain about what goes on. This actually undermines the prosecution's case for unmistakably identifying Darnay as the spy that the authorities are spotting. And now this is significant because at the end of the novel, the fact that Sidney and Charles look so much alike is going to play out in the end. Lucy and Dr. Marnet are actually watching the court proceedings, and that night Carton escorts Darnay to a tavern and asks how it feels to receive the sympathy of a woman like Lucy. Carton will, in many ways, despise and resent Darnay, because in many ways he reminds him of all that he himself, right, has lost, right, and what he might have been. We jump back to France. We've got the cruel Marquis, the Evremont. The Evremont will run down a child, a poor child, with his carriage, and he has this attitude of the upper class, typical of the aristocracy, right? that the poor are nothing but to be driven down and subjugated. The Marquis shows no regret, whatever. Instead, he curses the whole peasantry class, and then he hurries home to his chateau. When he arrives, he finds there his nephew, Darnay, from England. Arriving later that night, Darnay will curse his uncle. The French aristocracy, it's Dickens obviously, attempt to talk in informed ways against the upper class who thinks of themselves as noble because they are born noble. Think about our Chaucer's Wife of Bath's Tale, and we have those lectures on learnstrong.net in the senior A folder or the AP folder, right? The way he treats, he says to the Marquis, he says to his uncle, it's terrible. He renounces his identity, actually, as the Evermont, and he renounces his intention to, and he says, to stay in France. He says, I'm going back to England. That night, the Marquis gets what maybe he deserves. He's murdered in his sleep, and the knife has a note with it, with a nickname for the revolutionaries of the French, Jacques. That's it. We then will have time passage, a year. Darnay will ask Magnette for permission to marry Lucy. Darnay, as Charles, has fallen in love with Lucy. And he says that if Lucy accepts, that he's going to reveal his true identity, right, to Magnette. And Carton, meanwhile, pledges his love to Lucy, admitting that though his life is worthless, she's helped him dream of a better, more valuable existence. So you have two guys going after the same girl. Of course, this is a famous mantra. We know this from the story of the Odyssey, or I'm sorry, of the Troy Tale, and of course of Helen in Paris and Menelaus and all of that, as well as any number of other love triangles like the Arthurian one with Lancelot and Guinevere and all of that. On the streets of London, we're back now to London, Jerry Cruncher gets swept up in the funeral procession for a spy named Roger Clyde. There's going to be all kinds of political nuances and spying going on in this novel. Later that night, he will show his talents as a resurrection man, sneaking into the cemetery to steal and sell Clyde's body. Right? In Paris, meanwhile, we have another English spy. This is John Barson, who will drop into the Defarge wine shop. Now that's going to be an important one, so write it down. And Barsad will hope to turn up evidence concerning this revolution that's coming, which is still in its early stages, its secretive stages. Defarge, Madame Defarge, sits in the shop knitting a secret registry, which we don't realize until later, of those that the revolution is going to try to execute. I mean, we know what happens with the storming of the Bastille and the guillotine, especially if we're Dickens' audience originally. We know that, in fact, it turns horrifying. Madame Defarge is going to be a powerful symbol of what it means to sit and loathe and wait and loathe and finally get your chance. And when you get your chance, you're going to jack some people. We jump back to London, so you can kind of get a sense that this is a tale or a story of two cities. The city of London, the city of Paris, right? Obviously, these cities become symbolic as well of two different types of places. Dickens is obviously going to celebrate the way that England could somehow forego all of the insanity that was the French insanity of the storming of the Bastille and all that. We're back in London. Darnay, on the morning of his wedding, keeps his promise to Magnette. He reveals his true identity, and that night, Magnette will relapse into his old prison habit of making shoes. So he's, mentally, psychologically, he's obviously damaged. And for 9 days, Magnette will do this until finally he regains his presence of mind, and then he will join the newlyweds on their honeymoon. Upon Darnay's return, Carton will pay him a visit and will ask for his friendship. This will be key to the end of the novel. And Darnay will, in fact, accuse Carton of nothing. He will assure him, in fact, that he's always welcome in their home, and this is an act of true, you could argue it's forgiveness, friendship. I mean, obviously Charles knows that Carton is in love with Lucy, and he lets everything go. Then we come, of course, to the famous year, 1789. Now, in Paris, the peasants have had enough of it. They storm the Bastille. Wine falls onto the ground and splashes everywhere. We've got words written on walls. It's the French Revolution and the horrors of that revolution. And what's one of the ironies of all ironies? Well, what does happen often when mob scene happens? You tear down the very place where you live. You burn up and you throw rocks through the very windows where you normally used to shop. That is to say, you turn what was chaos into even more chaos, and the revolutionaries will begin to murder aristocrats in the streets, obviously. And Gabelle, a man charged with the maintenance of the Evremont estate, is imprisoned. Right? 3 years later, he's going to write to Darnay asking to be rescued. And despite the threat of great danger to his person, Charles Darnay will depart immediately for France. Now, Darnay is a stand-up guy. He's going to go to France, even though it's really seriously dangerous for him to do so. And as soon as Darnay arrives in Paris, the French revolutionists will arrest him as an immigrant, right? Lucy and Manet then will find their way to Paris. They hope they can save him. Darnay will remain in prison for 1 year and 3 months before receiving a trial. In order to help free him, Manet will use the influence, obviously considerable, that he has with the revolutionaries. They sympathize, obviously, with him for having served time in the Bastille. Darnay will receive an acquittal, but that same night, he's arrested again. Dickens loves this kind of thing. I mean, if you've read Great Expectations, if you've read David Copperfield, you know that Dickens loves to play this game of letting you think something good is about to, and then all of a sudden something bad happens. I mean, it's brilliant the way Dickens has this way of doing this. So Darnay again is charged. This time the charges, however, come from Defarge, his nasty wife. Carton's going to arrive in Paris with a plan to rescue Darnay and obtains the help of John Barsad. And it's at this point now all the strands of the novel start coming back together. Barsad turns out to be Solomon Prose, the long-lost brother of Miss Prose. And of course, here we have these coincidences of the Victorian novel that we always love to talk about. And this is, of course, Lucy's loyal servant. We now come to the Darnay Trial, and this, of course, will be reminiscent of the trial that we saw earlier, right? Where Defarge will produce this letter, right? He discovered it in Manet's old jail cell back in the Bastille that he's held on to all these years. The letter will explain the cause of Manet's imprisonment. Years before, the brothers Evremont, Darnay's father and uncle, enlisted Manet's medical assistance. Remember that Manet was a doctor, right? They asked him to tend to a woman that one of the brothers had raped, and her brother, whom the same brother had stabbed fatally, right? Fearing that Manet might report their misdeeds, the Evremonts had him arrested and thrown into the Bastille. Now, when the jury hears this story, they immediately will condemn Darnay for the crimes of his ancestors, which is obviously insane, and they will sentence him to die in the next day, 24-hour period, right? That is to say, insanity is now at play in all of Paris, obviously. That night, we're at the Defarge's wine shop. Carton, and again, this is one of these coincidences, which obviously you have to just kind of suspend disbelief for a little bit and go, well, yeah, right. But it helps the story along. We're in the Defarge wine shop. Carton's going to overhear Madame Defarge plotting to have Lucy and her daughter, Darnay's daughter, obviously, executed as well. Madame Defarge, it turns out, is the surviving sibling of the man and woman killed by the Evremonts, so she obviously has, bloodlust. Carton then will arrange for the Marionettes to immediately get out of France, right? He then puts his plan into action, which is obviously the end of the novel. He visits Darnay in prison. He does this interesting thing where he tricks him into changing clothes with him, and then he dictates a letter of explanation, and then he drugs Charles unconscious. And then Barsad will carry Darnay, now obviously disguised as Carton, to the coach that's waiting, and Carton, disguised as Darnay, will now await execution. As Darnay, Lucy, their child, Dr. Manet, will speed away from Paris, Madame Defarge will arrive at Lucy's apartment, obviously hoping to jack her up. There she's going to find Miss Pross, right? A scuffle ensues, and ironic of all ironies, Madame Defarge dies by a bullet from her own gun. Leading us now to the very end of the novel, Sidney Carton is going to meet his death at the guillotine. But he has a famous speech at the very end of this novel as he says that he's ready to die. And the very last words are going to be some of the most famous lines written in the English language. He says about the fact that he's willing to die in Charles Darnay's place. Again, I said it's a love story, but a love story of a powerful kind, of friendship, that he says, it is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known. Dickens, of course, has his way with these really pivotal powerful moments and the lines to go with it. That is to say, I'm fine with dying because I'm dying and it's the best thing I could have done with my life. In the very end, Sidney Carton is able to somehow redeem the life that he has lived, which hasn't been the best of lives. Of course, he's willing to admit that. Well, what's this novel say to us about our big five? Let's begin with epistemology. Notice the brilliance of the question of knowledge in this novel. Notice what happens when you have this absolutist, certainty, without question, epistemological position. Well, all kinds of terrible things happen. You end up gutting people on guillotines and that kind of thing. Notice the relativist position also doesn't work in this novel because it leads to mass chaos, the notion that there are no absolutes of any kind. The fallibilist position, as we talk about it in 303, is obviously the key epistemological position. You can be certain, but be cautious. That is to say, I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. This novel suggests that's the key epistemological position to take. Ontologically, well, this is a powerful novel about who you are and how you can grow and evolve and change. And it's no question that, notice, Sidney will in fact save Charles' life twice in this novel. And yet, you know, he's not the best of guys initially, right? He evolves into that kind of guy. What does this novel say about psychology? Well, Dr. Manette, for example, will be psychologically damaged from the experience of the isolation in the Bastille. Fear ultimately can lead to terror. Sociologically, the same is also true. Fear can obviously lead to terror. And the hysteria of mass hysteria, remember in our study of Miller's Crucible, we said something very, very similar, that you can get a bunch of people together, and in the isolation, they're amazing people, all alone. But when you put them all together, right, and then some kind of insanity starts to take place vis-a-vis some kind of notions of fear, very, very difficult to, to control. This is maybe why Machiavelli said in The Prince, a text that we studied, you can go back and look at that lecture again on learnstrong.net, he who builds on the people builds on mud. Finally, the theodicy question, and why so many terrible things happen in this novel. I think in the end, what Dickens is arguing is that notion that when bad things happen, and it's inevitable that they will, you've got to learn to ask, not why did this happen to me, but why did this happen for me? Pain, suffering is in fact a propedeutic, and you can learn from it, or it can sit, think of Madame Defarge, and fester inside of you, and ultimately events itself in some terrible, terrible way. Ultimately, maybe there is a bit of divine justice that she ends up